From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer, hosted by Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. Canada is debating how to respond to a drug overdose crisis that has claimed over 42,000 lives since 2016. British Columbia is largely seen as the epicenter. Last year alone, the province recorded over 2,500 overdose deaths. An estimated 225,000 people in BC use illegal drugs, and the toxic street supply, often laced with fentanyl, puts them at a constant risk. To tackle this, BC decriminalized the possession of small amounts of drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, fentanyl, and heroin for personal use in January of 2023, aiming to reduce stigma and barriers to treatment. However, the policy is now facing a reversal due to public safety concerns about open drug use. On today's show, we'll discuss the future of drug policy in Canada. Plus, we'll examine the role and effectiveness of supervised injection sites in addressing addiction and related public health issues. But first, here's Joy TV News videographer Dean Atwell from our Vancouver station with an inside look at this story. Take a look.
You have a 6-block radius. It is the most perfect example of where we're seeing the most rampant drug use.
Here in British Columbia, the province is trying to eliminate the use of illicit drugs without actually taking them out of the equation. Although possession of these drugs in small quantities is allowed, the use in public spaces is not.
We're dealing with overdoses on a daily basis. When I was working as a beat patrol officer here in the downtown east side, this is all we dealt with.
The province is 1 year into the 3-year pilot that aims to treat addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal one. The program is being blamed for an increase in open drug use and growing encampments.
Public spaces are, community parks, sidewalks outside of residences and particularly businesses. Of course, when you've got homeless people using drugs, where else are they supposed to do it other than going to a safe injection site?
Yeah, you guys can come in now. 80% of deaths in this province are in private residences, in hotels, or in single room occupancies where people were alone. Hi, Patrick.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
The idea was to bring drug users out from the shadows into the light so that they would be safer. If they overdosed when they were using drugs, they would be identified and helped.
Now you have these individuals that are openly using in public spaces where there might be a significant segment of the public that's basically saying, okay, you know what, we can understand the logic and the reason and the rationale behind introducing decriminalization. That's fine, but do it in that corner of the world.
You can't have people in a McDonald's high on crack and this sort of thing, right? You have to have a civilized society.
There's also the argument of if it's in public, if they get hurt, if they overdose, they need to be found and helped. But I don't think it should be out in public, in parks and stuff like that. There's kids around, they don't need to see that stuff.
I teach in an elementary school, so certainly when I go in the community, I want it to be a safe place for them.
I have to emphasize that this is a trial experiment, and we're learning as we go here. It's sort of a process of trial and error, trying to find the right balance to reducing the harm of drug use and getting people into treatment, while of course maintaining safe and orderly communities.
From the downtown east side, I'm Dean Atwell for the Zoomer.
Thanks, Dean. Now let's bring in our panel, both in studio and remote. Welcome to you all. Dr. Summers, I'll begin with you. So the federal government has approved BC's request to recriminalize the use of illicit drugs in public spaces. The request for change came about a year into the province's decriminalization pilot program. So this is really where the push for decriminalization rubs up against public safety. Can you give us some insight into what is really going on in BC? And does this necessarily mean that the policy for decriminalization leads to an increase in overdose deaths, as has been maintained by the federal Conservatives?
Thank you. Awesome question. And thank you for the invitation. What about our implementation of decriminalizing possession very ham-fistedly, unfortunately? So the policy, as people who've heard about the implementation of turning drug possession into an administrative offense in Portugal, for example, might have thought that, well, this could be a step in the right direction. But there were, unfortunately, critical differences, and the main one being that we did not envision a path to social reintegration for people once they were engaged with police. It makes absolute sense to avoid punishing people. We've done research here on drug treatment courts and other avenues that involve the justice system, and they can be highly effective, but it's far more compassionate and effective, demonstrably, to intervene with voluntary options. We unfortunately did not do that. Possession prior to the legal change over a year ago was never a significant contribution to arrests and sentencing among people who use drugs. So we took a large gamble, and some observers have said that the step toward decriminalization does not make sense as a real pathway to recovery the way we've gone about it. Instead, it looks more like the evidence supports this as a step in the direction of legalizing and regulating the sale of illicit drugs, which is a whole other kettle of fish.
You know, we're having a bit of a national debate, Christine, at the moment as concerns drug policy. And of course, a lot of this is happening in BC. But we have the Toronto mayor and Premier of Ontario also talking about it. What do you make of her request to decriminalize illicit drugs in Toronto? And do you think that there's a role for decriminalization in tackling the opioid crisis?
I don't think so. As was mentioned earlier, it doesn't seem to have had that big an effect on it. I think there's many other factors that we could focus on: treatment, housing, jobs, getting people into the system, because a lot of people that are homeless, they don't have any ID, they don't have anything. So this is a place where you want to focus on places where they can get access to all of those things to be able to get the treatment they need and to be able to move on with their lives.
Go ahead, Derek.
We already have de facto decriminalization in Toronto. The Attorney General in Ontario has not prosecuted, small quantity drug possessions in years. So, and I just wanted to give you some statistics that were provided to a parliamentary committee, and it was a 10-year analysis that involved 400 people in the downtown east side, and I just want to read some quick statistics about these 400 people. Okay. 95% of those people in the study had, a substance use disorder. 84% of those had a mental illness, and 74% of the 400 had a concurrent mental illness at the same time as their opioid use disorder. So the mental health aspect of this crisis and the substance use aspect of this crisis aren't separate. They are one and the same.
Yep.
We do not have a dedicated plan other than, hey, let's decriminalize small quantities. Great, but what's the rest?
So what is the exit strategy is essentially what you're trying to get
at.
What's
the off-ramp?
So it's interesting because I agree in principle that people that suffer from addiction should not be treated as criminals. Organized crime, of course, is a separate issue. But the problem is when you decriminalize, you effectively say to people, do as you please, and you essentially cripple the police. Do you not, Matt?
Human beings have been using drugs for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The idea that we're going to put laws in place and that's going to suddenly stop is ludicrous, right? So we're engaged in this futile effort and we're pouring billions of dollars into it. So I agree with you on some of those things that you mentioned. For us who work at safe consumption sites, one of the problems is we're supposed to be consumption and treatment services, but we can't get people into treatment because there are no detox beds and there are no beds for people in shelters or in respite hotels anymore. So we're expected to somehow have this magic pipeline to get people into treatment, but none of that exists. Decriminalization was supposed to be a two-pronged effort. It was supposed to have two purposes. One was to reduce stigma and to truly treat this as a health issue. We keep hearing people say, this is really a health issue, not a criminal issue, but then we keep it criminalized. So it was supposed to open up avenues for people to get better services, not necessarily to get into treatment and stop using drugs, but just to gain stability. Honestly, I don't care if people stop using drugs. I just want people to have happy, stable lives. So if they can maintain an apartment and they can have food and they can maintain relationships, whether they use drugs or not, doesn't really matter to me.
But isn't it the drugs? Isn't it such a vicious cycle? The drugs are what keep them in this place.
No, the drugs aren't a problem. Drugs are a symptom of a different problem. Every single person I've worked with has extensive childhood trauma. And so the best treatment isn't to try to focus on drug treatment, it's to heal that trauma and address those issues. Without doing that work, the drug stuff doesn't change.
All right, hold that thought. We're going to pick this up on the other side, so don't go away. We'll be right back with more of the Zoom. Welcome back. Continuing our discussion, Ontario's Premier Doug Ford recently called on the federal government to stop approving safe supply sites that provide regulated opioids to those with addiction. Ford criticized these sites for being approved by Health Canada without provincial input, leaving Ontario unaware of their locations and the amounts of controlled substances they dispense. Hours later, the federal government rejected Toronto's request to decriminalize small amounts of illegal drugs for personal use. So I do just want to pick up there. Dr. Koivu, let's talk a little bit about safe supply, just so our audience understands exactly what a safe supply site is. And you published an article in the Post where you talk about how it has actually only worsened the addiction crisis in London, Ontario. Can you support that with some evidence?
So we started a program in London of giving out opioids when we actually had a problem with a different form of the same opioid. So hydromorph cotton was causing a type of infection. We started giving out opioids to of the same type, Dilaudid, which is still hydromorphone, to people to prevent them from getting a heart valve infection and HIV. When we expanded the program to include giving it to possibly people who were using fentanyl, what I saw was an absolute increase in the amount of people that were using. Dilaudid used to cost about $10. Now I've heard it's even as little as 50 cents. So it's now cheap and accessible and very available and very much on the street. And your last person speaking was talking about people with trauma. When I started my work in addiction, the vast majority of people that I was working with had significant childhood trauma and a prescription from a physician. And those two things had led to their opioid addiction. Now, the vast majority of people I see started recreationally. They started as it now being a party drug without that same understanding of it being dangerous. So at 50 cents, it's easier to have Dilaudid available to you than beer, and it's easier to hide it. So I started seeing a lot more people who were young and really increasing the numbers of people that were using opioids far beyond what we could have imagined during the Oxycontin Purdue opioid-driven time period.
You're using that somewhat disingenuously because before this, London didn't have fentanyl. It had Dilaudid and morphine injection. I worked in London. And since then, fentanyl has come. So in terms of increased overdose risk, that came with fentanyl, not necessarily with safe supply. And we've seen that everywhere where fentanyl has come out. There's a sudden drastic increase in overdose deaths. I mean, we can look at places like England, which had heroin maintenance programs very successfully for decades and decades and decades. Switzerland, which has heroin maintenance programs. You're shaking your head. I mean,
Switzerland does indeed have a heroin prescription program. There are two main eligibility criteria for somebody to participate. One is an assessment of social stability. It's done usually by a psychiatrist. And it is usually the rule of thumb is having a full-time job. The second criterion is no use of any other drugs, which is checked by urinalysis. Together, what those two things help to underscore is that there is an expectation that other aspects of the social welfare system are supporting people to ensure that they are not homeless with untreated addictions and neglected other psychiatric symptoms, as Mr. Finkle referred to, which are almost ubiquitous. and that people are already sufficiently well integrated that the addition of prescription heroin is augmenting their integrated lifestyle and usually compensating for the long-term harms that unfortunately are in some cases irreversible of voluntary or addictive opioid self-administration. We can't compare what we're doing to Switzerland.
Now, one of the things that never seems to get mentioned on this type of program is how the drugs affect the brain. And once a person is addicted, the strong desire to have more and more and more of a drug in order to do what once was done with a small, weaker drug, they continue to have more and stronger drugs. So you can't simply introduce a supply of something that doesn't give them that same high that they're looking for and expect them to take it. They're constantly looking for something better. And so what do? They divert it, they sell it to wherever they can in order to try and get that stronger drug that hopefully will work. And so most of these programs are thought out by rational people expecting an irrational, drug-addicted person to make a rational decision, and they never will. So it's just not going to work.
I think you can look at the work of Dr. Carl Hart to see that people who use drugs do make rational decisions. I was on a safe supply program, and it was paramount in me coming off of fentanyl. So the reason I'm alive now is because of safe supply programs. These programs help a lot of people, and I don't think there's as much diversion as a lot of police-affiliated people and folks who are opposed to this like to make it seem in the way that it's being implied.
How about this? Is all moral panic?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that I agree on a couple of fronts, because we had the deputy chief of the Vancouver Police testify before a parliamentary committee after tens of thousands of these hydromorphone dilaudid pills were seized during drug busts by police across the country. The BC Coroner Service issued a report on the toxicology of young people who died of overdose in British Columbia. Before the Safe Supply Program was introduced, hydromorphone was found in no dead young people who overdosed in British Columbia. Well, that number, by the time the Safe Supply Program was introduced, that number went from about 2.5%, and then the next year it went to 5-point-something%. And anyway, in 2022, it was almost 25%.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. There's more when we return. Welcome back. In Canada, supervised injection sites have been around since Vancouver's Insight opened its doors in 2003. These facilities offer a safe haven for drug users to consume their drug of choice under supervision, all in a bid to curb overdose deaths. Advocates view them as part of a harm reduction strategy, but critics say they enable addiction and crime rather than addressing the root causes. Zoomer News videographer RJ Grubb spoke to the residents of one community affected by one of these sites. Take a look.
I'm walking on the Leslieville street where mother of two, Carolina Hubner-Macrath, was shot and killed about a year ago.
Moments before the shooting, 3 alleged drug dealers were seen fighting. 2 of these men pulled out firearms, and soon after, Carolina was hit by a stray bullet.
The shooting took place right across the street from the South Riverdale Community Health Center, which is known to house a safe injection site.
You don't even like talking about it, but you were here on the day that Carolina was shot. Like, our staff had to come out and help a woman who had been shot.
We've had 4 break-ins over the last 2 years, costing us about $100,000 worth of damages and stolen property.
We met with the CEO and the interim site supervisor, and they completely acknowledged the fact that what we're experiencing has to do with our proximity to the safe injection site.
They're like a necessary evil, I feel. They're saved lives. Due to my fentanyl addiction, this place saved my life because I would have OD'd and died.
They are a form of enabling people with addiction. If somebody has an addiction problem, I will gladly fork over my tax dollars if they want help. If they want to keep using, they don't get my money. And now I'm being forced to give my money for safe injection sites. I don't agree with that.
From the corner I'm standing on, I can see a rooftop daycare, a school, and also the safe consumption site.
You know, I have a 2-minute walk to the local school where my children are in 1st and 3rd grade. And it's, you know, on that 2.5-minute walk to school that my kids are walking by, you know, what is a pretty depressing sight to see, you know, starting Monday morning straight through until the end of the week. Even with the staff outside the center, it just kind of spills into the laneway here. And so it's kind of a daily occurrence of just looking out the back window and, you know, seeing people using drugs and injections, needles left in the laneway. And it's you know, it's not ideal for children, that's for sure.
I think they're super helpful. Having a safe space where you can use and where you can also get connected with other kinds of supports and care is really important. I welcome that in my community.
2 people were photographed by somebody in the coffee shop, pulling their pants down and injecting right in this lane. And you could literally throw a baseball from this spot to the center. And this happened during hours when the center was open. They could have used supervised injection site.
The lack of support for the local community is appalling.
Here we go.
Residents have yet to see the results of the consumption site review that was triggered by the death of Carolina. With a November expiry of the exemption that allows the site to operate, the future of the site is still unclear. One thing that is certain is the memory of Carolina will forever live on with the recent renaming of this parquet. Back to you, Marissa.
Thanks, RJ. All right, Derek, you live across from this site in Leslieville. Talk a little bit about what it's done to the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is these sites require drug dealers. And I think that's where the naive aspect of this otherwise noble idea is. Because as we're seeing now in Montreal, outside the new site that just opened a month ago near the Saint Henri neighborhood, the community there is suddenly seeing drug dealers and open drug use that they never saw before until the site opened. And back in 2016, before the South Riverdale site opened, my neighborhood was like one of the commenters in that piece was okay with it. And I'll bet a large sum of money that woman who made that comment doesn't live anywhere near that site. Okay, it's the people who live near the site that are forced to deal with drug dealers. Some of these drug dealers are armed. Some of them get in fights and shoot people. Not only were there drug dealers encircling the site still to this day, they were, you know, inside the site dealing as well, from right inside the supervised injection booths. And you know, one thing that doesn't make any sense to me is that in Ontario, South Riverdale, if it applied for a legal cannabis dispensary to sell legal cannabis out of that location, their application would be denied, given the fact that they are within 150 meters of 2 elementary schools and 6 daycare facilities. But they basically, you know, rubber stamped a safe consumption site that is predicated upon drug dealers selling fentanyl and other illicit drugs to the clients who come right inside.
You know, you bring up a really good issue about the drug dealers, the fact that people still throw that on
You're
drug
going to
dealers,
get into prohibition, right?
Which is why, one of the many reasons why people started safe supply programs, so people didn't have to go to drug dealers.
Yeah, but that didn't really work either.
You have a group of people who are responding to an unprecedented crisis and are trying new things to try to address it.
And they failed.
We're not going to Suboxone our way out of this problem. We're not going to methadone our way out of this problem. These are the things that got us to where we are. We're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. We have to think about new ways to attack this issue.
I'm talking about the effect that this. People never want to talk about this. You don't ever want to talk about the effect that these sites have on the people who live.
So let me ask this question.
My entire community is dead because of this.
Yeah, and so is my best friend. But it doesn't change the fact that people, drug dealers, are operating carte blanche with government permission, with the province's permission,
let me ask this
within
question.
150 meters of 2 schools and 6 daycare.
Hang on, let me ask this question. Go ahead, Christine.
But that shouldn't have happened. The province developed very strict criteria for the opening of consumption treatment services sites, and the 17 that I know of have been located properly, not near schools, because public safety is an important component.
Well, hang on,
Absolutely.
that's not true. In fact, we've got a graphic of where all these sites exist, and they're within 300
Oh,
meters.
they were never intended. Not all of them are licensed by Ontario. Some of them are federally licensed. licensed as well. So I can only speak to the ones that were licensed by Ontario. Public safety is, of course, important, and not being near a school is very important.
But it is near a school.
What I would say is you have to look at what's happening on the other side of it. A recent study that was just published in The Lancet, done by the Li Ka-shing Institute, showed that there is a 67% reduction in drug overdoses within 5 meters of a consumption treatment services site. So it is preventing death, but it has to be set up properly.
Matt, would you agree with the principle that harm reduction should not come at the expense of public safety?
That's what the Supreme Court said.
So when you talk about public safety, often the idea of public safety is only thinking about the housed, moneyed people, and somehow public safety doesn't involve the community people who are homeless and use drugs. They're part of the community too, and their safety needs to be part of this as well.
All right, let's pause here. There's more when we return.
We are now 8 years into a declared public health emergency in BC. We do not have a prevention strategy.
Dr. Summers, addiction, of course, is a very complex disease, but is this not enabling people to continue to do drugs?
Poisoning is now the leading cause of death in BC among youth. And 60+% of those youth were in provincial care. So this is not a cross-cutting equal opportunity risk. This is a risk that is very clearly related to a well-established psychological frame that involves despair for one's future, usually both psychological despair and social isolation. I mentioned before that most of the people who are dying of poisoning across the country were unemployed, another indicator of social isolation. We are now 8 years into a declared public health emergency in BC. We do not have a prevention strategy. There are ways of promoting recovery that are well established and have been marginalized from the discussion.
Like
Portugal, between 2000 and 2010, achieved the greatest reversal to date in street drug use, related poisonings, and infectious disease transmission. They achieved those changes over 10 years with about 60 therapeutic communities and 0 consumption sites, not one. It's not because they couldn't implement consumption sites, but by 2000, the harm reduction literature had already clarified that there were a host of risks associated with street drug use, homelessness being one of them, unemployment, lack of connection to healthy friends, lack of connection to family. These are all ongoing harms that we can address. Consumption sites do not address them. They are essentially like standing on the banks of the river, and they're one of the forms of water wings that we can throw out to people while they are in ongoing despair. And clearly they're not working. More people are accumulating in those same dire straits, and there's no discussion of the exit strategy, which came up earlier.
I agree with you about like the social isolation piece as being huge. The sites were never meant to sort of fix the problem. They were meant to keep people alive. And then if people can get into these services, they have a shot, because people can't get into treatment if they're dead. And treatment takes 10 years, 15 years. I mean, the thing that I have seen work the best for people is long-term trauma therapy, as well as a whole bunch of other sort of stabilization services. And that takes a long time. When you go to treatment, I've been to residential treatment, when you first go, they tell you this might take you 10 tries before it sticks.
But is that a condition of using one of these sites? Is that a condition? You walk in, you get your clean needle, you shoot up, and by the way, there's someone there to talk to you about getting off of drugs.
We will talk to people when people say like, hey, I want to get into detox. Hey, do you know anything about treatment? We will absolutely talk to people about it. We'll connect people with it. We will do all of that stuff. It just can't be a requirement of like, if you're going to come here, you have to work towards that.
You just said
Otherwise,
earlier
people
that
won't
you can't
come.
connect people, and what a nightmare it is to connect people, which is what I hear from
we-
our
we-
site. So
we tried
that's
it.
all broken. That's all broken.
And that's not our fault. We try to connect people.
Yeah, try to keep people
and
alive.
sometimes
That's a noble thing to pursue. However, in my neighborhood, since 2020, overdoses, the confirmed overdoses have tripled, as has
because the
theft
drugs have
and
gotten
assault in the immediate area of the center. They have skyrocketed. Do you know how many priority 911 calls how much they went up after the introduction of the center within a 150-meter radius of the center? 900%.
Derek, the drugs have gotten more toxic, so
Yeah, but
overdoses have
that's a
gone up.
different thing.
No, that's
Okay,
why
so
overdoses have gone
Can
up.
I make a comment about that? It's interesting. I don't know where that study was, but if you look in British Columbia, the percentage of overdoses, deaths, have gone up higher near the injection site, near the downtown area, than it has anywhere else in the province during the same period of time, year after year after year. Not only are there more total overdose deaths, but the percentage of overdose deaths around the supervised injection site has risen more than anywhere else.
When we first pushed to open these sites, we were very clear they needed to be 24 hours, and there needed to be a lot more of them, which I think would help your problem, Derek, because
Actually,
if there were more sites, your site would be less busy.
I don't think there's any evidence. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that.
We have limited numbers of sites, so people only have those options. I've reversed thousands of overdoses in the sites. I've lost hundreds and hundreds of clients. None of our clients have died when we've been open. It's always been 3 a.m, after hours, or other times when we've been forced to be closed, when people had nowhere else to use. And sometimes people have used around the site because they know sometimes there's other people there, or we have cameras. And so people feel like they're going to be seen.
So it's not sometimes. It is a lot that these guys take needles and leave.
Right. At our site, we do needle pickup all around the neighborhood.
2 boys in my street came home from swim practice at the end of April. There were 6 men shooting fentanyl beside his house. One had a knife. This is while the site was open, by the way, and many people just come for the needles and the drug dealers, and that's it. They have no interest in being supervised. And these boys had to get escorted by a neighbor into their house. The mother then called the police. You know what the police did? Nothing.
All right, let's pause here. There's more when we return. Welcome back. We've had a robust discussion on the complexities and controversies surrounding decriminalization and safe supply sites. And as we shift our focus, let's consider the future of drug policy in Canada. So what are the solutions that can effectively address the opioid crisis? And what can Canada actually learn about drugs from places like Portugal? Dr. Koivu, I'll begin with you. I think what we see in our society today is the consequence of decades of underfunding for addiction and mental health services. So what is it that we need?
Oh, absolutely. I think we need to recognize that we have a very complex problem. As Chuck mentioned, once people have an opioid addiction, it causes changes in the brain, and those changes drive what people do. There is a desire to not be in withdrawal. There can be a desire to get a greater high. So they're searching for a stronger drug or not experiencing the pain of withdrawal. But we need to also go back and look at how to address this. We need to look at the 4 pillars of addiction treatment. And I feel like we've lost perspective on that. The 4 pillars include prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and enforcement. And with prevention, we need to be addressing the social determinants of health. We need to be looking at ways to prevent people from getting into an addiction. But we also know from all of our data that accessibility and availability increase the risk of people becoming addicted. So we need to be addressing that when we're looking at addiction. We need to address the treatment is complex, staying in recovery is complex. And that takes to when people do inject in the public, we know that's a trigger. And I know that personally. I talked about my role as a physician. I've also lived in the community, and I'm a parent. I had a loved one who was in recovery for a number of years, had a very upsetting event happen, walked by people who were using, and then relapsed for 8 months. And it was about seeing people using and seeing the triggers. So we know that when people are using public spaces, that prevents both them from getting the treatment and help they need, as well as affects others.
Chuck, what should be the role of enforcement in this?
One of the things that's missing a lot in the enforcement issue is that enforcement can actually help get people into treatment. And in my last few years in the force, I ran a training course across the country teaching police officers just that. I have many friends that run treatment centers that have been in recovery for years, and many of them can name the police officer who finally got them into treatment, and they thank them for saving their lives. And we have to remember that of those 4 pillars, only 2 lessen the number of people with addictions. Prevention that helps stop people from getting there, treatment that pulls them out. Harm reduction, enforcement kind of helps keep the lid on. Harm reduction might keep them alive for a while, but if they don't have treatment, if they don't have a way out, it just prolongs what's going to happen. You have to eventually get them into treatment and help them get their lives back.
But I keep coming back to something you said earlier, Matt, which is you don't care if people stop using drugs, and you work in harm reduction.
Yeah,
How can you say that?
Because abstinence-only treatment isn't going to work for everybody, right? It's all great and say we need to get people into treatment and get them off drugs, but that's not how it works out for everybody. And so we can't just say the people that treatment works for, we're going to help and support, but the people who it doesn't work for, well, forget them because they're not doing what we want to do and abstaining.
But why can it not work for everybody?
So the research shows that 12-step programs only work for about 5% of people. Other abstinence-only programs have slightly higher rates of success, but they're nowhere near what we would want them to be or need them to be. The other thing is that the treatment space in Canada is completely unregulated. So we don't know is what they're doing actually effective or not. You can kind of, it's a bit of a wild west, and you can kind of do anything you want. Like equine therapy is gonna be with horses. Is that gonna help you come off drugs? Well, who knows? Maybe, maybe not. There's not a lot of research saying whether it works or not. And a lot of people are dying in treatment. A lot of people are dying in abstinence-only treatment. And the day that people are released from treatment, their risk of overdose death goes up exponentially. Same as the day that they're released from prison, because people are being forced into abstaining for periods of time, and then they use again, and their tolerance has dropped, and they overdose and die. And so harm reduction programs help avoid that from happening, so that if that person wants to try treatment again, they're alive to do it. If they don't want to try treatment again, and they want to support stability in their lives in other ways, like trying to get housing and all that other stuff, I support that as well. Derek, you have a lot of energy and passion behind you. You could be using that to go to the government and say, why aren't you building housing for all of these people? The folks that are using the alley, instead of being mad at them, be mad that they're being left there. And this is my community. This is the community I come from. Everybody that I grew up with, everybody I came up with is dead. Well, I have nobody left. They've all died of overdoses. And it hurts so bad to hear the hate and the vitriol.
It's not
Can I finish?
Okay.
The hate and the vitriol that gets lumped on these people. Because I know these folks. And they are good people who have families who love them, who have communities that love them, who help save people, who support other people. They aren't just these kind of terrible people with a knife. You know what I mean? Most people carry a knife because they are afraid, not because they're trying to go out and hurt other people.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. We'll be right back with more of the Zoomer.
Don't confuse people not wanting drug dealers being part of their child's walk to school with punching down on people with opioid use disorders. One thing I would clarify is that since the shooting last summer in my neighborhood, I've probably spent north of 60 hours of meetings with the leadership of our local health center / supervised injection site. And one thing I can tell you is that almost all, north of 95% of the people who use the South Riverdale supervised injection site, they are actually housed. They live nearby. They're not unhoused people. So I just want to set that straight. And the other thing is that Matt wants to talk about hate only going in the direction of housed people to drug users. And I would say in a community like Leslieville, where I live, that is absolutely 100% untrue. Everybody wants to help people, but what our complaint is that this center was mismanaged. And that's why we had 2 provincial reviews that were undertaken. One had to do with the shooting, but another had to do with it also has to do with the fact that this place wasn't managed the way, and it didn't have the relationship. I didn't interrupt you.
Sir, well, you didn't.
And they didn't have the relationship with the police that they were supposed to. The supervisor of our local division, after the shooting, made it eminently clear that the relationship was not good. There were stories about harm reduction staff going outside of the center, seeing plainclothes police officers trying to effect an arrest on a drug dealer and being interrupted by staff, telling them that they shouldn't be doing that. And, you know, there was a lot of animosity between the staff and the residents. Now, they are trying to work to correct some of that now, but a lot of damage is done. Like our community has, you know, lost complete trust in the leadership of that health center. And I don't know how long it's gonna take to get it back, but don't confuse people not wanting drug dealers being part of their child's walk to school with punching down on people with opioid use disorders or mental health issues. We live in downtown Toronto. We're used to seeing people with mental schizophrenia. We're used to seeing people who have, you know, poverty issues. We're used to seeing all kinds of stuff. People in our neighborhood we were prepared to deal with some, you know, drug activity around the center. But what ended up happening was way, way beyond the pale of even what people who live downtown should be expected to put up with.
I'm going to give Christine the final word. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I understand that there were issues there. There's no question that they weren't operating the way they should have. They shouldn't have been located that close to a school in the first place. They should have been picking up the needles and all the paraphernalia. They probably should have had security. I understand they have security there now. It wasn't operating the way it was meant to, but that doesn't mean that the whole concept is bad. It does save people's lives. It does give people a chance to get back into the community, to get a job, to get a life, and they have opportunities there that they didn't have before. Is it perfect? No, it's not, because we need much more in the way of rehabilitation and treatment services for people when they do decide that that's what they want to get into. And that's something that I think governments need to turn their attention to, is dealing with the significant mental health issues that people have out there that in part cause them to turn to drugs.
All right, a big thank you to my panel and to our viewers. Your voices drive these conversations forward. We'll leave it there. To get in touch, send us an email at comments@thezoomer.com. We'll see you soon. For now, it's time to zoom out.